This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. Nimitz at war, command leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Craig Symonds, Emeritus Professor, the Ernest J. King Emeritus Professor from the U.S. Naval Academy, writing of a man, Chester Nimitz, who was principal in the Pacific War of 1941 to 1945. The story is told from the point of view of command leadership, hence the subtitle. This is the story as I've never read it before, not concentrating on the battles, the moments to moments of the drama, the disappointments, and the grief, but on the relationships of the flag officers and their equivalent in the U.S. Army. Professor, a very good evening to you. Congratulations. It is Christmas, 1941. Chester Nimitz arrives in Pearl Harbor. What is his mission at that moment? How does he imagine he will proceed, given that the harbor is still burning? Good evening to you.
Good evening to you, John. Thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it a lot. We can imagine Chester Nimitz arriving by seaplane in the harbor at Pearl Harbor while the hulls of destroyed battleships are still visible, while small boats are still retrieving American bodies from the water. He has come without a staff, by himself, to take over a wrecked command, and his initial responsibility is to bring about some kind of stability, some kind of sense of the possibility of recovering from this disaster. So I think that's his first thought and his first job.
He's been sent there by Ernest J. King and by Secretary of the Navy Knox and the President of the United States, who tapped him for this job. What is it that they told Admiral Nimitz, and why did they choose him? Do we have an understanding of their thinking?
We have some. You know that Franklin Roosevelt always thought of himself as a Navy man. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War under Woodrow Wilson, and he kept his finger on the pulse of the Navy all the time that he was president. In fact, if I can tell a quick story, he was once handed a list of those suggested for promotion to flag rank, and he was running his finger down the list, and he came to a name and said, "What is this? I don't even know this man." Now, that suggests a lot about the fact that he expected to know personally the flag officers of the Navy, and he did know Nimitz personally, because Nimitz had spent the previous 2 terms as the bureau chief of what was called the Bureau of Navigation, but was really the Bureau of Naval Personnel. And in that role, he and the president interacted with one another on a pretty regular basis. So FDR knew Nimitz.
Ernest J. King, COMINCH, the commander of all the Navy in the Atlantic and the Pacific, a towering personality. Why did he choose Nimitz?
Well, King really had less to do with the selection of Nimitz than I think Roosevelt and Knox did. King knew Nimitz, of course, but King was a bit skeptical of Nimitz. King was a hard-driving, jaw-clenched, let's get it done, no nonsense kind of commander. And Nimitz was, of course, more of a let's understand each other, let's get along, let me listen to you, we'll reach an accommodation. Their personalities did not match. So King was a little bit uncertain that Nimitz had the toughness to get the job done in the Pacific, but FDR and Knox overruled him.
I learned from the professor that 16 times Chester Nimitz and Ernest King met, mostly in San Francisco, to talk about their accomplishments and differences. And each time I winced when Chester Nimitz was obliged to fly home to San Francisco, knowing he was facing Admiral King. We arrive in Pearl Harbor with everything in topsy-turvy, and Nimitz must solve leadership. The plot of the professor's book is how these men reacted to each other in this existential moment. And there are ironies here. One is the man who was in charge of Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet at the time, Admiral Kimmel, has now been relieved of duty. But I learned from you, Professor, the irony that could have been Chester Nimitz who was relieved of duty.
Oh, it's quite possible. In fact, a year before, Franklin Roosevelt had intended to nominate Chester Nimitz to command the Pacific Fleet. And Nimitz, who was junior to 50 more senior admirals knew that there would be resentment in the fleet. It would not be a good idea for him, as junior as he was, to take over such a prestigious position, and suggested that another more senior officer should have the job. And that, of course, turned out to be Kimmel. So that if Roosevelt had insisted and appointed Nimitz to that command in 1940, it would have been Nimitz and not Kimmel who was victimized by the Japanese attack.
Admiral Nimitz sets his headquarters up at near the submarine headquarters. He's a submariner. He thinks of submarines as an offensive weapon, and he will use them accordingly over these next few years. But I got the sense, Professor, that he was thinking, this is an overwhelming task, and I don't know how long I'm going to be here. I've got to get to work right away. And that's a revelatory part of his personality. I would even use the word humble. Is that inappropriate for Chester Nimitz?
No, I think that's fair, but keep in mind, he never told anyone at his command that he was worried or concerned or that he wouldn't last very long. He confided that to his wife in private letters. As far as anybody at Pearl Harbor saw, he was a confident, calm, assured commander who went from person to person, looking them in the eye, shaking their hand, listening to what they had to say. And he brought with him a sense that we can get this done after all. So that lack of certainty that's revealed in his private letters to his wife, he never let that show in his professional job.
Admiral King thinks of him as a fixer. What did that mean? Fixer.
I think King thought of Nimitz as essentially a manager of things. He sat at a desk, he moved papers from the in basket to the out basket. He could deal with personalities, he could solve problems, but he didn't think of him as a Patton or Halsey type, let's go get him commander. And you see that in these prodding radio messages that King sends to him almost every day. Let's get going. Let's do something. But I think King changes his mind about Nimitz over time.
There is a rivalry in the U.S. Navy at the time that is rendered in terms of shoe wear, the brown shoes versus the black shoes. What did that mean, Professor?
Yeah, when aviation first became part of the Navy hierarchy in the late 1920s, the aviators had different uniforms than the ship drivers, if we can use that term. They wore forest green uniforms with brown shoes. So the regular Navy officers called them brown shoe officers, and the aviators called the ship drivers black shoe officers. And they got along for the most part, but there was a sense of rivalry, without a doubt, between the two branches of the service.
I'm speaking with Professor Craig Symonds, Emeritus Professor of History from U.S. Naval Academy. And we're speaking of Nimitz at War, command leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. Chester Nimitz is now in charge of changing the story from defeat, the Japanese wave after wave of success in these first weeks. Remember, the Philippines is under attack at the same time Chester Nimitz arrives. This is a book that can be used by current officers in the U.S. Navy and retired and future to understand the relationships between the men who were given a task without adequate resources to restart the United States Navy in the Pacific after the Pearl Harbor attack. Immediately, Ernest King, the COMINCH, says, attack, attack, attack. He wants to get out there and punch. Nimitz doesn't have much of a fleet now. The battleships who had been regarded as the strength of all navies, the gun club, are either, 4 of them are very badly damaged or sunk, including the Arizona. 4 are badly damaged. So he has aircraft carriers. What is it that King wants him to do? And this is a good time to introduce Chester Nimitz's idea of calculated risk, Professor.
Yeah, calculated risk. That's an interesting concept. Nimitz came up with it when he was still a student at the U.S. Naval War College in the 1920s. And it's a relatively simple concept. It is that you don't take a risk that's greater than the likely benefit that will result from assuming that risk. And it's not something that you can calculate. The word calculation is a bit misleading. There are no numbers involved. There's no algorithm that can solve the problem for you. It's a matter of thought process, of nuance and assessment. But Nimitz is very good at this, and he sells this concept to his subordinate commanders as well, and encourages them to think about the possible benefit to be derived from assuming a risk and measuring the value of those two things one against another.
April 42, following two raids by the carriers in various outposts of the Japanese Empire, not significant victories, but at least it was blooding the nose of someone out there. Doolittle Raid is launched quite in secret. The idea of bombing Tokyo with Army Air Force bombers taking off from the deck of the Hornet Enterprise accompanies. Nimitz regards this as a stunt. Why does he think it's necessary?
Well, he doesn't think it's necessary, but Nimitz was very good at choosing the battles he thought he could win. And by that, I don't mean fighting the Japanese. I mean fighting those who gave him orders, who worked for him or who worked alongside him. Pick the battles you're likely to win, and those you're not likely to win, you just have to make the best of it. And that's what the Doolittle Raid was for him. Remember, Nimitz has only 4 carrier task forces. And here's a proposal that's going to send 2 of them, 50% of his entire offensive capability, off to conduct what amounts to a public relations stunt of dropping a few bombs on a few Japanese cities and then sacrificing the airplanes themselves by flying them in over China, perhaps finding Chinese airfields, but perhaps not. And Nimitz is skeptical that this is, in fact, a valuable calculated risk, but he's not going to get in the way of a scheme that originated in the White House.
The 2 big set-piece battles are Coral Sea in May and Midway in June. However, Nimitz makes considerations that are profound for these 2 battles because he trusts a man named Layton, and Layton trusts a man named Rochefort. Who are those, Professor?
Well, Eddie Layton was the intelligence officer on husband Kimmel's staff that Nimitz inherited from his predecessor. And he ordered Layton to report to him every morning at 8 o'clock in his office in advance of the staff meeting at 9 o'clock so that Nimitz had all the latest intelligence. And as it turns out, Layton was very good friends with Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, who ran this crypt analysis group in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, where they tried to winkle some pieces of useful information out of Japanese radio traffic. So Rochefort's team would try to decrypt as much of the Japanese radio traffic as they could. Rochefort would summarize it for Layton. Layton would bring it to Nimitz, and Nimitz could use that information or not, if he trusted it or not, to make decisions about the deployment of his forces. And in both the cases you cite, he did.
Yes, the Enterprise and the Hornet are tasked for Doolittle, so they're not available. What's available is the Lexington and the Yorktown. And there is the opinion that the Japanese are going to be sending an offensive force into the Coral Sea or somewhere through the Coral Sea. The assumption is they're looking to cut the communications link between Australia and the United States, which would have been a profound blow to the Allied forces. So Nimitz deploys Fletcher commanding the Yorktown and the Lexington, becoming the Battle of the Coral Sea. And I believe this is the first time, help me, that a battle is fought by ships that never see each other. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. This is an aviation confrontation. All of the combat takes place from carrier-launched airplanes attacking one another so that the ships never actually sight one another in the Coral Sea. And it is a bold decision by Nimitz to do this. He, with half his carrier force gone, he sends the other half into the Coral Sea, 5,000 miles away, to get in the way of a Japanese force that on paper looks like it's vastly superior. It's quite a risk, especially at a time when the overall Allied strategy is to concentrate on Germany first. So here's a quiet man that King wasn't sure was bold enough, taking an extraordinarily bold decision.
The Lexington is lost. The Yorktown is badly damaged. However, there's more news from Rochefort and Layton that the Japanese are planning an offensive against what they discern is Midway Island. That means Nimitz now has two carriers, the Hornet and the Enterprise, and he learns when the Enterprise returns that Admiral Halsey, commanding Enterprise, is so afflicted with a skin condition he can't serve. Nimitz makes another risky choice. He chooses a man named Spruance. Who is he?
Raymond Spruance was the commander of the cruiser-destroyer screen for Halsey's carrier task force. Nimitz knew him. In fact, Nimitz had already decided prior to the news about Halsey's skin condition that he wanted to appoint Raymond Spruance as his own chief of staff, as Nimitz's chief of staff. So he knew him and trusted him, so that when Halsey said, when Nimitz, first of all, asks Halsey, well, if you can't go, who should take your spot? And Halsey immediately said Spruance, and Nimitz immediately accepted that, even though there were other, more senior aviator admirals available. Spruance was the guy both Halsey and Nimitz wanted to take over that job.
Yes, Spruance is the quiet man. Nimitz looks perfectly chatty compared to Spruance.
That's true.
We get back out there with three carriers, the Hornet, the Enterprise, and the immediately repaired Yorktown. It'll take 6 weeks, Admiral. You've got 36 hours. It's an amazing, dramatic moment. They get back out there, and the plan is to ambush the Japanese carrier fleet. Nimitz has to wait. Again and again, Professor, in your book, Nimitz is waiting for news. They radio silence to the fleet. So the anxiety is enormous. The success is also overwhelming. At this point, we're learning a great deal about how the admirals dealt with each other. And I want to mention there's one particular case here that comes up again and again. Mitscher commanding Hornet. After action, a great success, 4 Japanese carriers destroyed. What is it that Mitscher does that makes Nimitz give him a second choice? We have a little more than a minute.
Well, Marc Mitscher, Pete Mitscher, which was his nickname, is one of the early aviators. He was excellent pilot, and of course, getting early into the aviation community means he got promoted up to command the Hornet. But during the Battle of Midway, it's pretty clear that Mitscher thought to himself, I'm the aviator, I'm the pilot, I know what the Japanese are likely to be doing, and so I'm going to send my planes west instead of to the southwest. And when it turns out that that was not a good idea, the after-action report that he filed disguised that fact. Spruance knew it, he told Nimitz about it, and Nimitz quietly removed Mitscher from his projected command of a carrier task force and instead assigned him to command a PBY squadron on the north coast of Oahu. But he did not make an issue of it. He did not prosecute Mitscher. He did not publicly reveal this information, which remained pretty secret for most of 70 years.
You use the word escrow. The book is Nimitz at War, Command Leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, the relationships of the flag officers and the generals as they prosecute the Pacific War, which was secondary in the minds of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the British and American working together. Europe first, Europe first. Ernest King, however, had other ideas, and Ernest King has sent Chester Nimitz to Pearl Harbor to command this rotating story of ships and men and aircraft. Now, King says Coral Sea and Midway are such a success, we need to go on the offensive somewhere. They do not have adequate what is called sea lift. They do not have adequate what are called forces, divisions. However, they're going to get out there even though they're short. What Nimitz says repeatedly in the professor's book, do the best we can with what we've got. So we go to Tulagi, which we know as Guadalcanal. The Marines land, and the fleet that accompanies them, the ships that accompany them, cannot stay all the time. They have other duties, and they don't want to be tied to a shore to make themselves vulnerable. These are very risky moments again, Professor. What was Nimitz's thinking of Guadalcanal? Did he want to wait, or was he okay with the idea of going now, even though we have inadequate resources?
Excuse me. Nimitz did indeed plan on taking the offensive as soon after the Battle of Midway as possible. What he had in mind was an attack on the Santa Cruz Islands, which are a little bit to the southeast of Guadalcanal, and Tulagi. Tulagi is a tiny little island, but it's where the Japanese headquarters were. But across the Sea Lark Channel from Tulagi is this much larger island of Guadalcanal. And while Nimitz and King were in San Francisco having a conversation about whether or not they could undertake this small offensive, news arrived that the Japanese were building an airfield on Guadalcanal. Oh my gosh, King says, we've got to preempt that. We have to stop that. So that immediately the target is changed from the Santa Cruz Islands to this island of Guadalcanal. And as you mentioned, it's a bit of a risk to undertake this now in August of 1942, because the United States really doesn't yet have the material superiority to launch an amphibious operation. But King believes it's essential to go ahead now anyway, and so the Guadalcanal operation begins in the second week of August 1942 by a shoestring, just enough shipping to get the men ashore, maybe not enough shipping to keep them adequately supplied. And for the next 6 months, this is going to be a very precarious movement onto this jungle-infested island of Guadalcanal.
Life in Pearl Harbor at the same time for the Admiral, because he's making these decisions and managing this enormous landscape of the Pacific Ocean. And they are also conducting their lives while they're waiting or while officers are coming in. The Admiral likes a small staff, but it will grow to hundreds in the course of the war. He also likes exercise, especially walking a great deal. Who are the walkers?
Well, the Walkers are a family. There were about 5 families in Hawaii that were considered the Big Five, who were well-to-do, who'd been there for generations, who had a lot of real estate and financial interests. And Nimitz had gotten to know the Walker family, Sandy and Una Walker, when he was in Hawaii in the 1920s, building the submarine base as a lieutenant commander. When he came back in 1942, at the end of 1941, to become SINCPAC, Commander-in-Chief Pacific, they reached out to him and said, why don't you come have dinner, and so on and so on. And as time passed, he became closer and closer with the two of them. And their resort on the north coast of Hawaii became kind of a bolt hole for him. He would go there to escape the pressure of the office or just to get away for a night, sometimes for a weekend if he could. And that relationship grew stronger and stronger over time.
Yes, and that exercise was critical to him. He also liked to throw horseshoes, but of course, the dog steals the scene. He has a dog back home called Freckles, who likes to howl along when his wife, Catherine, plays the piano. What we care about is the scenes of home life that he imagines sitting in Honolulu, entertaining all of these people. And so what we have now is a vision of Nimitz, the family man, and Nimitz, the absolute commander. He was a man for precision, but he also had a playful streak. He liked to listen to music late at night in his quarters. And he early on decides that he's going to get through this with a minimum amount of demand on his staff, on the people, but he's overwhelmed with visitors. Do the visitors start right away, Professor? I know towards the end of the war, there are delegations arriving every day. Are they there in August of 42?
No, in the first 6 months of the war, there are not a lot of visitors. Hawaii was still considered the front line in 1942, and not really till the end of that year and into 1943 did visitors, congressional delegations, senior officers, groups of British officers and others, newspapermen who would arrive expecting to be greeted and entertained and wined and dined. And this became a pretty serious burden on Nimitz, who liked to focus on his work. You mentioned his walking. He got up every morning and walked at least 3 miles before breakfast, and then walked 6 miles after work and before dinner. So he put in probably as many as 10 miles a day. And this was power walking. This was really brisk stuff. So he keeps himself quite active, and he's inundated not only with his professional responsibilities, but with his essentially diplomatic responsibilities of entertaining and charming delegations who come to visit him in Hawaii. And he's very good at both.
but listening all the time to the traffic from Guadalcanal. The Marines, Vandegrift commands the Marines. The overall operation is commanded by a man named Ghormley, Admiral Ghormley, who Nimitz likes. Ghormley is not on Guadalcanal. He's at Noumea, which is a free French post. But Ghormley is a man who is, I think Nimitz at one point visits him in frustration, says he's too cautious. What is it that Nimitz thinks about Ghormley when he's reading this overwhelming traffic of inadequacy? Ghormley doesn't have enough of anything to maintain this battlefront.
It's true. And Nimitz is quite sympathetic with Ghormley's dilemma. I mean, he's been asked to conduct this early offensive with inadequate resources, having just arrived in the Pacific, arriving as Nimitz did without a staff. He has to put a staff together. He has to organize a headquarters and then immediately conduct an offensive against a Japanese position in the Solomon Islands. So he's really in a tough spot. And Nimitz sympathizes with all of that. But at the same time, he also recognizes you have got to be more proactive. For one thing, you have to go out there and supervise things for yourself. And Ghormley, who had some health problems at the time, he had seriously infected gums. And he's living on an army transport, an old army transport from World War I, anchored in the bay that has no air conditioning. I mean, he's really struggling. And Nimitz, on the one hand, recognizes the need to support Ghormley as much as he can, but at the same time has to accommodate King, who's pushing him from the other side to get going. Let's be more proactive. Let's do more stuff. So here's Nimitz, the man in the middle, if you would, being the fixer that King had always wondered about, trying to resolve this dilemma. And to see him work both sides of this problem is revealing to his character.
There is another relationship that's falling apart at this point, and Nimitz observes it. Admiral King does not like Admiral Fletcher. It seems almost based upon, I don't know, it wasn't justified. Fletcher's been very successful in the battles he's been in. The speculation was that it was because of the loss of the Lexington. What does Nimitz make of this enmity between that King has towards Fletcher?
I think that animosity really began when Fletcher was assigned to command the rescue expedition out to Wake Island in December of 1941. Wake Island was under attack by the Japanese. The initial attack had been repelled just 3 days after Pearl Harbor. And so the United States sent a carrier task force to go out there and reinforce the garrison at Wake. But as it was making its way to Wake Island, had to slow down to resupply, to refuel. You can't get all the way to Wake Island on one tank of gas. So they had to stop and refuel en route while underway, but it slowed them down enough that the Japanese gained the upper hand, took Wake Island, and King always kind of blamed Fletcher for that because he got the idea that Fletcher worried more about how much fuel he had in his gas tank than he did about getting the job done. It's more than a little bit unfair. He never really outgrew that. And King was dissatisfied that the Battle of the Coral Sea wasn't a bigger victory than it was. So King and Fletcher just never quite saw eye to eye, and eventually King managed to shelve him.
There will be a change of command for Guadalcanal when we come back. Nimitz makes a decision. Nimitz at War, command leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. Craig Symonds is the author. The decision of the flag officers. Ghormley has struggled to provide for the U.S. Marine Corps on Guadalcanal, which is being overwhelmed again and again by attacks, mostly at night by the Japanese. However, the Japanese mean to dislodge them, early on, the Japanese were fighting a war of attrition, believing the Americans would wear out, and then they would settle this war with negotiation, some fantastic version. However, there's no patience by Ernest King. So Nimitz makes a command decision to replace Ghormley with Halsey. Why, Professor?
Well, I think that Nimitz believed he had given Ghormley every chance. He'd visited Ghormley in Noumea. Nimitz had, in fact, personally flown to Guadalcanal, met with Vandegrift, walked the lines, awarded Vandegrift with a medal in his bunker. decided that Guadalcanal could be held. Now remember, Guadalcanal is a large island. The Marines are actually holding a small little footprint around the airstrip, and the Japanese have the rest of the island, and the Japanese are hammering at those lines almost daily, and the Marines are holding out. They never give way. They hang on to that airfield. But at any given moment, it looks like the Japanese, who are increasing the size of their forces on Guadalcanal, might in fact overwhelm that small enclave. And Nimitz is worried enough about that he thinks somebody more proactive, somebody in better health, is needed to rescue those circumstances. So he agonizes over this. But once Halsey is recovered from the skin disease that kept him out of the Battle of Midway and becomes available, Nimitz perceives that Halsey and Halsey's attitude in particular is what is needed at Guadalcanal. And so he tells Halsey to take over. He writes Ghormley a very sympathetic letter saying, in order to take advantage of Halsey's gifts and experience, he's going to take over your command. Thank you for your hard work.
We need to spend some time with Bill Halsey here because we'll see him again. He's a player that keeps coming back for Nimitz's consideration. Bill Halsey is aggressive, yes, but he's also a man who believes in pleasing the press with outsized statements. We quote some of them still today. The reason we care about this is that Halsey is Nimitz's attack, whereas other admirals are Nimitz's management, care, and Spruance would be an example of that. Does Nimitz know early on that Halsey can get out of control?
He does. He's got Halsey's number from the beginning. And for the most part, he appreciates the gifts that Halsey can bring. He's pugnacious. He's belligerent. One of the reasons newspaper reporters love him so much is they ask him, what are your plans? And Halsey answers by saying, kill Japs, kill more Japs. That's the kind of frontline attitude that you need in war. You don't necessarily want that individual to be the overall commander. That could be risky. But in terms of who's going to lead the charge at the front line, Halsey's your man, and Nimitz knows that, but he uses him carefully. He uses him for what Nimitz's son later called cavalry charges. But for the thoughtful, planned offenses, he'd prefer to have somebody like Spruance in charge.
Right away, there is trouble, however, with Halsey's attack, just keep attacking. The Battle of Santa Cruz, Battle of Guadalcanal, Iron Bottom Sound, these are naval exchanges that the U.S. is not getting the better of because of the inadequate shipping, I believe, because of the distances. However, Nimitz doesn't find fault with Halsey being in one direction. I'm guessing at this point that Nimitz again is using calculated risk. I've got to weigh what I need to accomplish, which is Guadalcanal, with the losses at sea. Does he reflect that in his letters, Professor?
He does to a certain extent, but I think he appreciates that Halsey, as his predecessor Ghormley had been, is in a tough spot. He doesn't have all the resources he needs. In particular, he doesn't have sufficient air cover. The Marine Corps Air Squadron on Guadalcanal, called the Cactus Air Force, does a wonderful job, but there just aren't enough of them. And the Japanese keep coming and coming. The Japanese overall strategic plan from the start was to wear out the Americans until the Americans appreciated they couldn't win this thing. Then there would be a negotiation and the Japanese would come out with most of what they wanted. So they're pushing and pushing, and Halsey is pushing back. And Nimitz's job is to give Halsey all the support he possibly can to allow him to hang on. And he kind of appreciates his belligerent approach to that circumstance.
There's another dispute. It has to do with Douglas MacArthur in Australia, Brisbane, commanding, to his mind, the return to the Philippines. His focus now is, I shall return. He left behind the Philippine Army and the American contingent, chiefly Marines, to go into horrible conditions, badly managed by the Japanese in prisoner of war camps. And MacArthur wants to return, and he wants all the resources available so he can return as fast as possible through the South Pacific. This is an argument that cannot be settled, but there is a meeting between Halsey and MacArthur at Brisbane, I believe. Halsey flew there. What do they make of each other? Because they're both outsized characters.
Oh, you'd expect a clash of personalities when the two of these men get together. Keep in mind that the Pacific Ocean area that's commanded by Nimitz and the Southwest Pacific Ocean area, which is commanded by MacArthur, are both theaters of war. So MacArthur doesn't work for Nimitz. Nimitz doesn't work for MacArthur. They are co-commanders of separate theaters. But in order to carry out the offensive in the Solomon Islands after Guadalcanal, Halsey has to cooperate with MacArthur. So Halsey flies to Brisbane and they meet. And as you said, John, you'd expect there to be fireworks. But MacArthur had decided he could gain more by charming Halsey than by confronting him. And when MacArthur wanted to be charming, he was good at it. And Halsey later wrote in his memoirs, I had never met anyone who I immediately felt greater sympathy with in my whole life. After 5 minutes, we were the best of friends. So I attribute this mostly to MacArthur's decision to co-opt Halsey. If this man's going to work in my theater, I want him to be loyal to me. And the way to get that done is to charm him. And he did.
Guadalcanal is winding down, and now the offensive. Where do we go? This is strategic thinking now, no longer tactical thinking. The debate is between the South Pacific route that MacArthur prefers, and he wants to command everything, and the Central Pacific, which is straight up the middle towards Formosa, what original thinking, and then on to Japan. As I understand it, it's King and Nimitz who want the Central Pacific. And what is the opinion of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who are making these decisions back in Washington? Do they acknowledge the Central Pacific is the way to go, or is there a compromise?
Well, this is an extraordinarily complicated set of circumstances and has a lot to do with personalities. MacArthur, as you point out, wants to go from Australia along the north coast of New Guinea and through the Solomon Islands directly to the Philippines. He considers that a moral obligation to return, as he said he would when he left the Philippines back in 1942. The U.S. Navy has had a plan in the books to fight Japan by working across the Central Pacific in an island hopping campaign that they have been wedded to for more than 20 years. So here you have these two competing approaches, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, their view is, wait a minute, Europe first. This is all secondary. So the distribution of resources is Europe first, then the Pacific, and even then it's split in half. So there's a lot of complicated working parts here. But in effect, it's a competition between the Navy's view and the Army's view about the best way to get to Japan. And as you say, it boils down to this meeting in Hawaii with President Roosevelt himself there personally. He's come over by sea on the cruiser Baltimore, and he and MacArthur and Nimitz meet together, supposedly to hash this out.
Yes, that will happen in 1943. Right now, we've got to get on to the first of the contests with the Japanese Army and its style of dying in place. Craig Symonds' new book is Nimitz at War, Command Leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. And we're speaking of Chester Nimitz at war in the Pacific. It is now the point where the Central Pacific Campaign, starting in the Gilbert Islands, driving towards the Japanese islands, is underway with the landing at Tarawa, a small island, a series of atolls. And this is where the Marines have to practice their amphibious landing that will get better and stronger throughout the war. In fact, amphibious landings in general are now being invented by the Marines and the Army. And they require specialized ships that don't exist at this point. You all think of the landing craft from D-Day, the drop of the front and the men piling out. Well, that didn't exist as they land at Tarawa. This is November of 1943. The professor's book concentrates on relationships, however. So we begin with Chester Nimitz's relationship with the U.S. Marine Corps. He worked very well through Halsey with Vandegrift at Guadalcanal, but now we introduce a man named Holland Smith. What is that relationship, Professor? Thank you.
Well, Holland Smith was the man who was in charge of Marine Corps training. And in the previous decade, the Marines had made amphibious operations their particular area of expertise. This derived in part from the fact that in World War I, the Marines had fought in France as if they were a regular army division. And they realized that in order to maintain their unique character and personality, they needed to develop a particular expertise. And aware that Japan was a likely foe, they developed throughout the late 20s and the 30s this expertise in amphibious operations. We now associate the Marines with amphibious operations from the start, but that really is a relatively new thing here. And the training for this was supervised by Holland Smith. Holland Smith was not a patient man. His name is Holland M. Smith, H.M. Smith. And of course, he got to be known as Howling Mad Smith because of his tendency to fly off the handle when things did not go well. But he considered the Marines his own, and he was particularly determined to make sure that he was not only in charge, but that he took care of his men as they went ashore in this first major amphibious operation of the Central Pacific Drive at Tarawa. And the difficulty there, the geographical difficulty, is like many islands that are part of an atoll in the Pacific, there was a large coral shelf that extended from the beach a quarter mile or more out into the ocean. And the landing craft the Marines were to use required at least 3.5, probably 4 feet of water to make sure they could get ashore. And there was a neap tide at Tarawa in November of 1943, and many of those landing craft got stuck on the coral shelf. The Marines had to climb out over the side and wade ashore through withering machine gun fire. And of course, Howling Mad Smith was irate about this.
These events are taking place while Nimitz is also dealing with competing personalities and opinions at headquarters. And we need to introduce some of those conflicts because this isn't about battles. Those are profound and tragic. This is about flag officers dealing with their plans and their disappointments in their experiences. There is an admiral named John Towers who becomes the deputy commander-in-chief of the Pacific, Deputy Sinkpak. He is an aviator first and a naval officer after that. And that conflict with Nimitz is a reprise of other conflicts that we see, brown shoes versus black shoes. Chester Nimitz did not seem to have a great deal of patience with John Towers, although he kept including him into conversations to calm him down. Is Towers regarded today as someone who had a better idea, who was more disposed towards the aircraft? Because more and more equipment is now showing up. It's no longer the shortages of 1942.
Towers has his defenders in the historical community, but he has more who I think recognize that Towers was simply a difficult personality. In fact, the only reason he's in the Pacific, or at least the major reason he's in the Pacific, is because King found him intolerable as head of the Bureau of Aeronautics in Washington. He made King's life more difficult, and in order to get him out of Washington, he foisted him on Chester Nimitz. Nimitz also didn't particularly want to work with John Towers, who was difficult, but he accepted, again, realizing that he needed to accommodate when necessary. He accepted that this was necessary. What made Towers difficult was largely the fact that Towers believed to his very core that only aviators should ever be allowed to have any command authority over carriers or airplanes or air groups. Therefore, people like Spruance, people like Nimitz should never be able to tell aircraft carriers what they should do. It should only ever be an aviator. And so he was a particular champion, for example, of Marc Mitscher. King was more interested in getting the right man to do the job, regardless of his service affiliation. That's why he put Fletcher in charge of a carrier group and Spruance in charge of a carrier group. Now, Halsey did have wings, and so he was okay. by Towers' standards, but Towers would not tolerate Fletcher or Spruance, or for that matter, Nimitz. And Nimitz had to put up with this.
You recall that Mitscher was challenged after Midway, and I used the word escrow. The professor uses the word escrow. Mitscher is back. Marc Mitscher is now commanding the air part of the Fifth Fleet, and which will eventually become the Fifth and the Third Fleet. And Mitscher is restored, rewarding Nimitz's opinions of giving people second chances.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think that if Spruance had been the decision maker here, Mitscher never would have come back. Spruance never quite forgave him for his missteps at Midway. But Nimitz believed that not only he deserved a second chance, he saw something in Mitscher and went to Spruance and said, I'm going to make him a carrier group commander. If he does well in that, he might take over the carriers as a group. And Spruance, very Nimitz-like, accepted that this was something he simply had to put up with. And down the road, of course, Mitscher becomes the great, magnificent Mitscher, as he's known to his biographer. So it works out.
Tarawa is a bloodbath, and Nimitz visits it after it's been secured. And the quote in the professor's book, "The first time I've smelled death." It was an appalling failure of good intelligence and good planning for naval bombardment. There were corrections made, but we need to focus on the theme of calculated risk, because it comes up again now when we go to the Marshall Islands. Gilbert's first, we're going right up the center. Marshalls are next.
Yep.
The Allied opinion is we should start with a small part of the Marshalls, and Nimitz says Kwajalein. What's his thinking, Professor?
Well, he knows that Kwajalein is the heart of this. It's where the main Japanese base is. And if you take the heart, if you choke that off, all the other auxiliary islands will fall by the wayside. But the fear is not just among the Joint Chiefs, but among his own subordinate commanders. His amphibious commander, his air commander, his ground, all say, no, Kwajalein's too tough. We should go to one of the outer islands first. Look how hard Tarawa was. But Nimitz, who had visited Tarawa, as you point out, believed that he learned from that experience all the things that needed to be done to make an amphibious operation more efficient. He ordered that they be applied. He got different kind of landing craft. He developed a new protocol for targeting naval gunfire on the beach, and said, nope, we're going to go straight to Kwajalein. I think we can do this. And of course, it was done quickly, with minimal loss, and he was therefore justified in that decision. But here's another case, as you point out, of applying calculated risk. It was a bit of a risk, but Nimitz assumed the benefit was greater than the risk.
Two big sea battles, telling the story of Spruance and Halsey when we come back. The book is Nimitz at War, Command Leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. Craig Symonds is the author. We're concentrating on the relationships of the commanders, the flag officers, the generals of the Marine Corps, the generals of the Army. We now come to Spruance commanding the fleet during the landings on the Marianas. And there is an opportunity to take on the Japanese fleet and to go up against what looked at this point, a Japanese attempt to launch all of its aircraft and sink American carriers. There were a great number of carriers. They're coming on all the time now. The arsenal of democracy is delivering big carriers after big carriers. And Task Force 58 then takes on the Japanese attack in what is known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but is otherwise known as the Turkey Shoot. What do we learn about this moment and Spruance's decision-making, Professor?
Well, keep in mind that the United States Navy in peacetime always plans for contingencies. What might happen? How can we prepare for that? It's happening today as we speak. And it certainly happened throughout the 1930s. And the planning that most Navy officers assumed would come forth is that at some point in a possible future war with Japan, there would be a major naval battle somewhere in the Western Pacific, and that naval battle would decide the outcome of the war. So American naval officers and Japanese naval officers too have been looking forward to this big confrontation. But Spruance is assigned the job of capturing the island of Saipan. And he, who is in overall command of all the American forces, says that's job one, protecting that beachhead. So when the Japanese fleet threatens the American invasion, Marc Mitscher, who commands the American carrier force, which, as you mentioned, is now greatly expanded, 15 aircraft carriers, he wants to go out and get them. And Spruance says, no, our job is to cover the beachhead, to make sure the Marines on shore have adequate air cover. You stay here close enough to cover the beach and defend yourself from this Japanese attack. Well, the result is an air battle. The Japanese send airplanes to attack. The Americans throw up hundreds of airplanes to defend. The American planes are newer, faster, better. Their pilots are better trained, and we have twice as many of them as the Japanese. So the outcome is, as you suggested, a kind of turkey shoot in which the faster, newer American planes shoot down 400 of the Japanese airplanes, essentially breaking Japanese naval air power in the Pacific. But Mitscher decides he has been denied the opportunity to go out and sink the carriers themselves. He does launch a very late attack the next day, but it's not enough. And so there's resentment among the aviator community that this black shoe, Raymond Spruance, did not let them go do what they wanted to do, which was go after the Japanese. And that controversy simmered for weeks afterward.
Yes, and now we come to one of the decisions that is going to make Nimitz's job with Halsey difficult. After that turkey shoot in January, we have the Battle of Lady, the storming ashore on Lady by MacArthur's forces, the army. And guarding that invasion fleet are the seventh Fleet, which is commanded by a man named Kincaid, answering to MacArthur, and the Third Fleet, commanded by Halsey, answering to Nimitz. And the Japanese send out a tricorner attack by 3 different admirals. 2 of them have big battleships coming from the Sea of Japan through the Philippines, through the Philippine archipelago. Another one, the carriers are coming from the north. Carriers are empty, but Nimitz and Halsey don't know that. Halsey takes the bait and goes after the carriers. And now we have the Battle of Lady Gulf that is again and again, and I learn, a debate at the U.S. Naval Academy, and I'm sure the professor has led many of these debates.
Indeed, I have. That's absolutely true. And I think it's a great teaching point because it shows the difference between tactical and operational confrontation and clear strategic thinking. The Japanese in the Battle of the Philippine Sea had lost most of their trained carrier pilots. So they have carriers, but they're toothless. They have maybe 100 airplanes total, but they send them out anyway, not to fight. They send them out as bait. Their job is to draw Halsey's huge force, the Third Fleet, away from the Philippines so that the Japanese battleships and cruisers can sneak in among the American landing craft and destroy the invasion force. That's the plan. It's a desperate plan, but it almost works because Halsey takes the bait. He heads north after those empty carriers, sinks a couple of them, but the result is that the Japanese battleships and cruisers get through this narrow passage of the San Bernardino Strait and get right on the cusp of entering the Leyte Gulf and attacking the American invasion force. Now, astonishingly, the Japanese lose their nerve and turn around and don't get that done. But it was such a near-run thing as to be almost seem fictional.
Yes, it still does. We go over and over, and we're going to get tactical here. There's a moment Nimitz is watching this, but Halsey maintains silence. He doesn't get any word. He sends words to Halsey, but Halsey doesn't reply. At one point, Halsey has indicated he's designated his fast battleships. These are new built, magnificent machines, Task Force 34, to guard the invasion fleet, but he takes it with him north, chasing the Japanese carriers. Chester Nimitz sends out a message saying, "Where's Task Force 34?" because he's getting emergency alerts from the American jeep carriers who have been guarding the landing fleet that are defenseless against Japanese warships coming out, cruisers and battleships. And
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Halsey gets offended, and Halsey spends an hour in a tantrum. That's a mysterious hour, Professor.
It is a mysterious hour unless you understand the psyche of Bull Halsey, and then it begins to make some sense. Keep in mind that one of Nimitz's leadership characteristics is that he perceived his job as the strategic theater commander. Identify the objective. Make sure your subordinate commander knows what it is, what your expectations are. Supply him with everything he needs to be successful. Give him all the information you can, and then let him run the battle. So Nimitz did not like to interfere with a subordinate commander who is engaged with the enemy 8,000 miles away. So he really does not want to send Halsey any orders. And yet, Nimitz is receiving these panicky, sent in the clear radio messages, Japanese battleships about to enter Leyte Gulf, help, help, help. And he doesn't want to interfere, but finally he decides, well, I can at least ask Halsey a question. I'll ask him, where is Task Force 34? Well, I don't know how much of this you want to go into. It gets a bit complicated in terms of the padding. But there's misunderstanding at the end, because part of the padding in the message is the whole world wonders.
Yes.
And that is sent to Halsey on the bridge, and he reads, where is Task Force 34? The whole world wonders. He throws it on the ground, stomps on it with his foot. What right has Chester to send me a goddamn message like that? And this is when he and his chief of staff, Mick Carney, go down into Halsey's flag cabin and sulk for an hour before he makes a decision.
And this becomes the moment that Chester Nimitz is going to have to review again and again, because when we come back, next up, Halsey in a Typhoon. Book is Nimitz at War, Command Leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. Craig Symonds is the author. A dramatic moment that is replayed again and again in debate at the U.S. Naval Academy and everywhere you read the book about the Pacific War. Halsey's decision-making at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, but it doesn't stop there. This is a war. And in that war, the Fifth Fleet is going to again take over, and there are going to be landings at Guam. They're going to be landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa coming up in the new year. We're going to turn into 45. But before that, there's something that isn't about the Japanese. It isn't about the Americans. It's about nature. There's a typhoon in the middle of December, 1944. And Bill Halsey again was given a chance again and again by Chester Nimitz to explain his excesses, again makes a decision that leads to the deaths of 800 sailors, the loss of 3 ships, damage to the fleet, this invincible Task Force 58. And the review board faults Halsey afterwards. And Nimitz travels out to meet Halsey and to talk about this at the time. Again, this gets complicated, Professor. It becomes almost as if Nimitz doesn't have a way of disciplining Halsey. Did Halsey take advantage of that?
I don't know that Halsey took advantage of it. In a way, Nimitz's attitude was let Halsey be Halsey. I mean, one of the things Nimitz liked about Halsey was his aggressive attitude. He could be counted on to push the envelope, to go after the enemy as ferociously as he possibly could. That's not always the right decision in every operational circumstance, but often it is. And for those circumstances, Nimitz wanted to be able to give Halsey his leash. So when Halsey is ordered to support MacArthur's landing on the island of Mindoro in the Philippines, he says, well, yes, I'm going to do that, but first I have to refuel my fleet. The fleet has to be constantly refueled, and logistics in this war are a huge problem because, of course, all the oil has to come from California. So he gives a fleet rendezvous for the ships to refuel, and it happens to coincide with a major typhoon. And Halsey keeps trying to maneuver to get around. He's reluctant to go further away from the Philippines because then he won't be able to get back to support the landing. So in the end, that turns out to put the fleet in even greater jeopardy. And he loses, as you say, 3 ships, damage to many others, hundreds of others, the loss of 800 lives. It's like a major defeat, only it's a typhoon. And it's because Halsey was too stubborn to say, well, I've got to get out of the way. And he was stubborn because he was eager to get back in the fight. Now, from Nimitz's point of view, his motives are admirable, even if his decision was foolish in the end. But another factor here for Nimitz is that by now, in late 1944 and into 1945, Halsey is practically an icon of the American public. He's been on the cover of Life and Time. He's quoted in the newspaper all the time. He's the guy who's going to beat the Japanese. He's going to ride the emperor's white horse through the streets of Tokyo. To get rid of him now would be a blow to American morale, and applying calculated risk, which produces the greater benefit to winning the war, Nimitz decided keeping Halsey, in spite of mistakes he may have made, is the better decision.
Nimitz is overwhelmed by delegations arriving in Honolulu, so he makes a very good decision. I'm going to move closer to the battle. And he makes a decision to go to Guam. The Seabees build him what appears to be a complex, and his whole staff moves to Guam up on the side of a hill looking west to the battle, which is now going to be at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. This is the arsenal of democracy at work. They show up one day, it's a tropical island. The next day, it's got movie theaters and Betty Grable. Wonderful. However, Nimitz is also commanding these difficult personalities, and we need to take into account some of them now. Okinawa. Okinawa is Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima first. Iwo Jima is a small rock. The Japanese army have now come up with a tactic that we first saw at Tarawa, which is to die in place, requiring the Marine Corps to dig them out day after day, week after week, with enormous casualties. One way, however, that strikes the Marine commanders is that the Navy is not providing adequate preparation fire. And I believe this happened with Iwo Jima. Is that right, Professor?
That is correct. That is correct. There is an argument whether more naval gunfire support over a longer period of time and even more shells would have made much of a difference is, quite frankly, unlikely. But the Marines felt, or at least the Marine commanders felt, that they had been abandoned to a certain extent. They asked for 10 days of heavy naval gunfire support prior to the landing. They got 3. But on the other hand, the Army Air Force planes had dropped 76 days worth of bombs all over that rock in the middle of the Pacific. And it's not clear, given the Japanese defenses, they were dug deeply into the volcanic rock, whether additional naval gunfire support would have made much of a difference. But it does exacerbate the sense of rivalry, is that the right word? That maybe the Navy isn't supporting the Marines as much as they should. I think that's probably an unfair argument, but given the Marine losses on Iwo Jima, it's easy to see why they would try to look for a reason why their losses were so great. And the real reason is, as you point out, the new Japanese tactic, instead of launching these sacrificial banzai charges, instead went down deep into the ground and said to the Marines, come in and get me. And that's costly.
Before we do Okinawa, Chester Nimitz makes a trip all the way back to Washington. He gets to watch, I believe this is when he attended his daughter's wedding. It's wonderful. He has a very strong family relationship and they all work very well together. His son is a decorated commander in the submarine force, and he's given the Navy Cross, a very successful father. He meets with FDR and he's shocked at what the president looks like. Does he convey that to anyone besides his wife, Catherine, in his letters?
No, he may have said something to Sock McMorris as chief of staff. If so, that has not survived. We do know he mentioned it to his wife, Catherine, because I was going to say most, about half of those letters have survived. So we're aware of that. But he has met FDR several times. He knew him before the war, obviously. And during that, and then, of course, that famous visit in Hawaii when they spent several days together. And now he sees him in 1945, and he is shocked by how the president has aged. He has a gray pallor. His hand visibly shakes. He's still witty. He's still charming. He still laughs, but he physically looks like he is declining.
Chester Nimitz returns to Guam, Okinawa, population of 500,000, 75,000 Japanese soldiers to die in place. That is the plan. So the U.S. Navy now has 17 carriers. This is Task Force 58, 8 fast battleships. I write down these statistics because it's overwhelming. The Japanese Empire is now fighting on suicidally, led by a junta, military junta around the emperor. And there is no possibility of victory. There is, in fact, just death. And that leads to the weapon that is invented first in November and now comes in waves, the kamikazes. And as I understand it, Professor, from your reporting from Nimitz's point of view, there is no solution to the kamikazes except for to disperse, use as much of air power as we can to defeat them on their way in. But the losses are ferocious, and all of their ships are capital ships. Even Spruance's Indianapolis is badly damaged by the kamikazes.
Yes, that's all true. You know, Chester Nimitz gave a speech at the Naval War College after the war in 1946 when he was invited to come talk to the students there about the war in the Pacific. And he was praising the War College curriculum for how they anticipated almost all of the things that they would subsequently encounter in the Pacific. And he said, you know, all the things we faced, from amphibious operations to naval battles, all of those things we had anticipated through our studies here at the War College. All but one, and that one was the kamikaze. So yes, the introduction of the kamikaze, the desperate idea that, well, we don't have many trained pilots, we don't have the ability to go out and drop a bomb on a target and get back again, but if we turn the airplane into a bomb and that pilot is willing to sacrifice himself, we can inflict enough damage on the Americans that they will still think about opening negotiations for a compromise solution. It's a truly desperate gambit. But it did result in horrifying losses, more than 30 major warships, more than 3 sunk, more than 300 damaged, thousands of lives lost. So the kamikaze tactic, if you throw morality out entirely, is operationally effective and terrifying. But even that is not enough.
Spruance is exhausted. Nimitz decides to relieve him in place outside of supporting Okinawa on May 27th with Halsey. So the 5th Fleet becomes the 3rd Fleet, same ships, different commanders. There's another typhoon, the June 3rd typhoon. And again, Halsey makes a strange decision. Does this have any more explanation than the first typhoon, Professor?
It's the same explanation. And it's not one, I mean, you could say, you know, the old joke about fool me once. But here again, he makes almost the same decision. To get out of the way of the typhoon, he has to go further away from the targets that he wants to attack. And he's unwilling to do that because he's so aggressive, he can't wait to get back to the fight. But it leaves his ships, or many of his ships, in the path of that typhoon. And again, there are terrible losses, ships sunk, men killed, planes lost. And this time, the investigating group says, no forgiveness. He should be dismissed completely, out of the Navy. And Nimitz steps in and says, think about what impact that would have on the war effort to fire arguably the most popular commander still fighting in the war, because by now, of course, Germany's been defeated. At this moment, it's just not, so it may be just, but it won't help the cause. And so he says, no, we'll let that go again. And the guy who takes the fall is John McCain's grandfather, John Slew McCain, who is blamed for leaving the ships, even though he had asked Halsey, can I move the ships? And Halsey said no. McCain takes the rap, and that was unfortunate.
The book is Nimitz at War, Command Leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. Ernest King, COMINCH, who is always present, 16 times they meet. King's messages to Halsey, to Nimitz, and Nimitz's messages to King, the professor is quoted throughout the book. There's something called the Gray Book, which the professor tells us is 8 fat volumes of all these communications, dated very carefully, COMINCH to SINCPAC, SINCPAC to COMINCH. Now they're debating in person and also by wire about what is to be done about the Japanese homelands who will not surrender. Okinawa is now secure, and they will not surrender. And so the opinion I take it, Professor, from Nimitz and King's point of view is blockade will force them to the peace table.
I think that's true. I think naval officers at almost every level did not believe an invasion of the home islands was worth the risk. Here we are back to calculated risk. It would cost so much, and we've all heard the line, oh, it would cost 100,000 American killed. Very likely, perhaps more. Fewer consider the fact that it would have cost possibly millions of Japanese to die, because Japanese culture was such that surrender was so obnoxious that no Japanese soldier, no Japanese participant in the war at any level could honorably surrender himself. Therefore, you must fight to the death. So if everyone in Japan fights to the death, what are the consequences of that? There was literally talk within the combined staff in Japan of the honorable death of 100 million. Now, the prospect of that was so horrifying that both King and especially Nimitz believed that avoiding an invasion by depending on a strict naval blockade, executed mostly by submarines, by the way, as well as bombing from the air, would create a circumstance where the Japanese would have to accept the Potsdam Agreement, and that is to say, accept an end to the war on terms that the United States would dictate to them. Now, that did happen. Of course, we know there was also an outside influence that we may talk about subsequent, but in general, the Navy wanted to blockade and bomb. The Army more interested in conducting an assault. George Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, certainly Douglas MacArthur, who was designated as the man who would command that invasion, both believed an invasion would be necessary and were well advanced in their planning to execute it.
Marshall and MacArthur getting ready for Operation Downfall. There's a dispute between Nimitz and MacArthur as to who's commanding the amphibious forces, who's commanding the army on the beaches. It's all going to be pushed aside for what Nimitz learns in March of 45 was a special weapon. What did he know, Professor?
He knew that there was a special project that was developing a special weapon. He was informed he had I think it was an Army major, flew out to his headquarters at Guam to sit down with him, just the two of them, and he had a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist, and he briefed him on what this was. But of course, it hadn't yet been detonated. The test at Alamogordo hadn't taken place. The scientists were pretty sure it was going to work, but he notified Nimitz because it was important to make sure that the prospective targets were not interfered with by pre-planned bombing raids or submarine attacks or anything else. So he did know about it, but that doesn't mean he understood at every level exactly what the impact would be. He knew the day of, the time of, and that there was a thing, but that's about it.
The bombs are dropped August 14th, U.S. time. Nimitz sends this message, very simple, to all of his forces in the Pacific: cease offensive operations against the Japanese forces. The war is over. So we need to speak of Nimitz after the war. Of course, he's on the Missouri for the surrender. However, right away, they wanted him for CNO. Who was against it?
Well, he had always, I think from the time he was a middle grade officer, every officer perceives that the top of the pyramid, the job you want is Chief of Naval Operations. That's the highest job there is in the Navy. And certainly once he became Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, it's only logical that when King stepped aside, that Nimitz was the logical person to succeed him. But because of his relation, particularly with Jack Towers and the aviation community and others who supported the aviation community, he was perceived as a bit stodgy. They weren't sure Nimitz was the guy they wanted. James Forrestal, the new Secretary of Defense in the reunification system, was skeptical of Nimitz, but Nimitz had friends too. And some of those friends went to bat for him and convinced Forrestal that Nimitz was the only possible man. And if you didn't appoint Nimitz, people would wonder why. So Nimitz did get appointed Chief of Naval Operations, but interestingly enough, not for a 4-year term, but only a 2-year term. And Nimitz accepted that. I'll do 2 years, then I'll step aside. And he did.
King has 5 stars. Leahy, William Leahy, the president's chief of staff, FDR's chief of staff, has 5 stars. Nimitz has 5 stars. These Congress created 4 of these possibilities, and the 4th one was left unfinished by the end of the war. The obvious example is Spruance deserves 5 stars, but the decision is made to give it to Halsey. What I like about Spruance is that he remains the quiet man, and he wants the U.S. Naval War College. That's wonderful. It speaks very well of him, Professor.
I certainly think it does. Spruance Auditorium, Spruance Hall at the Naval War College, named in his honor. Very appropriate honor, I think. Spruance was almost a professorial type. I'm assuming that's a good thing here. And I think the fact that he said, no, I don't want to be SINCPAC, which would have been the logical place for him to go. Instead, Jack Towers gets to be SINCPAC. And Spruance specifically asks to be made president of the Naval War College so that he can apply the lessons he learned in the Pacific War to the curriculum of the middle grade and senior officers who are the students at the Naval War College, so that they are better prepared to fight the next war whenever and wherever it is. It speaks extremely well of Spruance that he wanted to do that.
Nimitz does not write a memoir, but he does contribute to a book, Sea Power, 1961. He dies in 1966, which becomes part of the education of all cadets, as I understand it. And the professor met the man when he first arrived at U.S. Naval Academy, who co-authored or who worked with Nimitz on that. Do I say that correctly, Professor? We have 30
Mostly. I'm going to correct you, however. We don't have cadets at the U.S. Naval Academy. We have midshipmen. They have cadets at that other school up on the Hudson River. But yes, it is true that when I first became a professor at the Naval Academy in the mid-1970s, I actually shared an office suite with Ned Potter, E.B. Potter, who, with Chester Nimitz, was the co-editor. It was actually written by several members of the faculty, but edited and rescripted entirely by both Ned Potter and by Chester Nimitz, who took that assignment very seriously. And that book, now sadly out of print, the long version of Sea Power, which talked about naval history from triremes to today, was the book we used to teach the next generation of midshipmen at Annapolis.
Nimitz at War, Command Leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. Craig Symonds is the author. I'm John Batchelor.